She was just a woman reading a book in the park, until two police officers handcuffed her in front of a growing crowd. What they didn't realize was that she was a respected judge. And weeks later, they would walk into a courtroom only to find her seated at the bench. This isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about justice, dignity, and what happens when the system is forced to confront its own reflection. Stay with us, because what began on a quiet bench in Fort Collins will ignite a movement far beyond the city limits. If this story moved you, please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps give light to voices that deserve to be seen and heard. It was supposed to be a peaceful afternoon in Fort Collins, Colorado. The sun warmed the shoulders of joggers weaving through the park trails, while families laid out picnic blankets beneath towering oak trees. Children laughed near the playground, and the breeze carried the smell of grilled corn and fresh-cut grass. Amid this idyllic setting, a poised black woman sat quietly on a bench by the pond. Her name was Camille Johnson, a highly respected civil rights attorney. Today, for once, she wasn't defending anyone or drafting briefs, just reading a thick hardcover novel resting in her lap. It was a rare moment of calm, stolen from her packed calendar. Then came the sound that cut through the calm like a blade: screeching tires. A police cruiser rolled to a stop at the edge of the grass, drawing curious eyes from passers-by. Two officers stepped out, uniforms crisp, expressions unreadable but stern. Their eyes swept the park and zeroed in on Camille, the only woman sitting alone by the water. "Ma'am, can we speak with you for a moment?" one of them called out, his voice more commanding than courteous. Camille looked up, undisturbed. She closed her book with care and replied, "Of course." Her voice was even, her posture composed. The second officer stepped forward, less patient. "We got a call about suspicious activity in the area," he said. Camille's brows knit together. "Suspicious activity? I'm just reading a book." She lifted the novel slightly, as if that would help clarify things. But they weren't interested in her explanation. "Can we see some identification?" the first officer asked, his voice clipped. Camille's heart began to race, but her tone remained steady. "I'm sorry, I don't understand the reason for this." "It's routine," the second officer replied, but the tone suggested otherwise. By now, a small crowd had gathered nearby. Some murmured in confusion, others exchanged looks heavy with unease, sensing the imbalance of power in the exchange. Something about this didn't feel right. With a quiet sigh, Camille reached into her coat pocket and retrieved her wallet. She handed over her driver's license. The officer squinted at it, reading slowly. "Camille Johnson?" he said, the name rolling off his tongue with a note of mockery. "What's your business here, Miss Johnson?" Camille inhaled sharply, resisting the urge to let emotion slip into her voice. "I live here. I came to enjoy the park. Is that a problem?" The officer's lips tightened. "We'll see." But they didn't leave. Instead, the questions escalated. Where was she headed next? Was she always alone like this? Did she often carry that kind of book? The second officer gave a short, humorless laugh. "Waiting for someone, or just sitting here for show?" One hand hovered near his belt, his stance unmistakably intentional. Camille had faced down hostile witnesses, courtroom bullies, even political pressure. But this wasn't like that. This wasn't about facts or truth. This was a power play, and she knew it. "I won't answer any more questions," she said firmly, "unless you tell me what I'm being accused of." Her refusal seemed to flip a switch. "Don't get smart with us," the first officer snapped. "We're just doing our job." "And I know my rights," Camille replied coolly. "I haven't broken any laws by sitting in a public park." But logic wasn't part of the script they were following. The first officer stepped forward, reaching for her arm. "Stop resisting," he barked, though Camille hadn't moved a muscle. "What are you doing?" she gasped, her voice rising for the first time. The tension in the crowd thickened. A man raised his phone, recording now. Another stepped closer, murmuring, "That's not right." "I said, stop resisting," the officer repeated louder, as if performance alone could justify the act. Camille's heart slammed in her chest as she felt the cold metal snap around her wrist. The humiliation burned deeper than any pain. They pulled her to the car as if she were a threat, not a scholar, not a woman of the law. She didn't resist. But she turned her head, searching the crowd. Her eyes locked with a young woman recording everything. For a moment no words passed between them, just a look that said, "Please don't let them bury this." The car door shut with a dull thud, and in that moment Camille knew. This wasn't the end of anything. This was the spark. In the back seat of the police cruiser, everything felt smaller. The world, the air, her voice. She'd spent years defending the law. Now she was watching how it twisted in real time. She wasn't shocked, no, but she was enraged. The officers remained silent, save for the occasional crackle of the police radio, their faces unreadable. But Camille was writing a mental transcript of every second. Because this time it wouldn't be quietly dismissed. This time they'd face her again, only next time it would be in a courtroom, and she would be the one standing tall, not as the accused, but as the voice they tried to silence. Camille stared blankly out the window of the cruiser, her reflection faint in the glass, merging with the blur of trees and city blocks flashing by. Her wrists throbbed where the metal cuffs dug into her skin, a bruising reminder that her dignity had just been stripped away in public. But the real humiliation awaited her at the station. The booking process was cold and mechanical, designed not just for processing but for dehumanizing. She was fingerprinted without care, photographed like a criminal, and shoved into a brightly lit holding cell where the fluorescent lights buzzed incessantly. Before the door slammed, one officer chuckled and said, "Enjoy your vacation?" Camille sat on the metal bench, arms wrapped tightly around her ribs, as if trying to hold herself together. She kept replaying the moment in the park, how a peaceful afternoon had so quickly spiraled into something out of a nightmare. The answer, painful in its simplicity, was rooted in the same bitter truth she had spent her career confronting. Prejudice didn't need a reason. It only needed an excuse. Hours passed. Then, footsteps. A younger officer appeared outside her cell, holding a file thick with printouts. "You're being charged with resisting arrest and obstructing a peace officer," he announced flatly. Camille's voice cut through the air, sharper than intended. "On what grounds?" He didn't blink. "You can take it up in court," and just like that, he turned and walked away. She leaned back against the wall, exhaling slowly, forcing herself to regroup. The accusations were weak, insubstantial at best, but she knew the road ahead would be steep. Cases like this didn't get resolved on logic alone. Later that night, she was released on bail. The moment she stepped outside, the crisp night air hit her like a wave, so different from the stale heat of the holding cell. On the curb stood Marissa, her closest friend, fellow attorney, and unwavering anchor. Waiting. "Camille!" Marissa rushed to her, voice full of concern and fury. "Are you okay?" Camille nodded, though a tremor betrayed her. "I'm fine," she said, but the words hung hollow in the air. They drove in silence for a while, the city lights flickering across Camilla's bruised thoughts. Marissa kept glancing over, waiting for her to speak. Finally, Camilla said it, almost to herself. "I'm not letting this go." Marissa tightened her grip on the steering wheel. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking I'm tired of this," Camille answered, her voice low and fierce. "I have the knowledge, the training, and the platform to fight this, so I'm going to." That same night, long after the city had gone to sleep, Camille sat at her kitchen table surrounded by legal textbooks, statutes, and notes scribbled in a rush of purpose. Her fingers trembled, not from fear but from conviction, as she began drafting a civil rights lawsuit against the officers and their department. As days blurred into weeks, Camille barely slept. Then, a spark. The video from the park, recorded by the young woman with the phone, went viral. People across the country saw what had happened, and they weren't silent. Emails flooded in, letters, phone calls, messages of solidarity from strangers who had lived their own versions of injustice, each voice stitched into Camille's growing armor. She wasn't just building a case now, she was building a movement, Her resolve deepened with every story she read. She was no longer fighting just for herself. She was standing for those who had been silenced, pushed aside, or punished for simply existing. Still, justice rarely came in a straight line. At her law firm, partners began to grow nervous. They feared the case's publicity would tarnish the reputation they had so carefully curated. Camille stood her ground. "This isn't about me anymore," she told them, calm but unwavering. "This is about creating precedent." That video didn't just expose injustice, it ignited a conversation this city has needed for decades. She declined every interview request. The media attention meant nothing to her. What mattered was the case, the facts, the truth. Each night, after the world had quieted down, the weight returned. She'd lie awake, replaying the arrest in her mind, the cold bark of commands, the snap of handcuffs, the tightening throat of injustice. It made her stomach churn. But it also made her sharper. One evening, as she sifted through a pile of federal case law, Marissa arrived with a container of takeout. She placed it gently beside Camille's laptop. "You've been at this for hours," she said softly. "I don't have a choice," Camille replied, eyes still scanning the screen. Marissa sat across from her, watching. "You know this is bigger than you, right? People are watching, looking to you." Camille finally closed the laptop. Their eyes met. "I know," she said quietly. "That's why I can't afford to lose." She threw herself into preparation with surgical focus, reviewing similar civil rights cases, dissecting precedents, collecting testimony, gathering irrefutable evidence. She assembled a team of attorneys, not just colleagues but warriors, united by a shared belief in justice. But this battle wasn't only about what happened in the courtroom. It was about the quiet shift taking place across the city. In schools, in barbershops, in council meetings. People were talking, listening, rethinking. The image of Camille being led away, calm, proud, and unyielding, had become a symbol, not of pain, but of power. And though the path ahead was steep, Camille walked it head high, heart steady. Because she knew, this time, they would be the ones answering the questions. This wasn't just coincidence, it was something bigger. It was a chance to show the world what justice should look like. By mid-morning, the courtroom hummed with low whispers as people filed in. Most had no idea what was about to unfold. On the docket, it looked routine. An internal misconduct hearing involving 2 officers accused of excessive force during an unrelated arrest. To most observers, it was business as usual, another disciplinary case, another dull procedural matter buried in paperwork. Officers Carter and Daniels sat at the defendant's table in full uniform, their badges glinting under the overhead lights. They leaned in toward one another, whispering with a practiced indifference. To them it was just another box to check, another complaint to dodge, another judge to sway. Then the chamber doors opened. The chatter stopped mid-breath. Camille entered in her black judicial robe, walking steadily toward the bench. The air shifted, every movement radiated calm control. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. Her presence alone was thunderous. As she took her seat and adjusted her papers, her eyes briefly lifted to the defense table. Officer Carter's face drained of color, his jaw slackened in disbelief. Daniels blinked rapidly, his lips pressed into a hard, twitching line. It took them a moment to register what they were seeing. The woman they'd dragged from a park bench in handcuffs, now seated as the judge presiding over their case. Camille allowed the silence to breathe, just long enough to let the weight of the moment settle into every corner of the room. Then she spoke. "This court is now in session," she said, voice clear and steady. The gavel echoed like a drumbeat of reckoning. The officers shifted uncomfortably. Their once casual posture had vanished. Carter leaned toward their lawyer, whispering harshly. The lawyer nodded, tight-lipped, but kept his focus on Camille. For the first time in weeks, Camille felt the shift. She held the authority, but not for retribution. This wasn't about evening a score. This was about elevating the standard, about showing restraint where others had shown none. She would not sink to their level. She would rise and bring the law with her. Opening arguments began, and Camille remained composed, taking notes with sharp precision, but every so often her gaze drifted back to the defendants. She noticed the tremble in Daniel's hand, the way Carter's knee bounced beneath the table. During recess, the officers stepped into the hallway, rattled. "Where is she, the judge?" Carter snapped in a hiss, his voice barely contained. "This has to be a setup," Daniels muttered. Their attorney stepped in quickly. "It's not. It's a rotation, a coincidence. Stay focused. She's not your enemy. Your actions are." But neither man listened. The walls were closing in, and they couldn't stop looking over their shoulders. Inside, the trial pressed forward. Camille ensured every voice was heard, every witness protected, every objection considered without bias. Her professionalism was undeniable, but her very presence threw the officers off balance. The weight of their own actions sat heavier with each passing hour. At one point, during a witness's testimony, Carter looked up and met her eyes. It wasn't defiance, it wasn't fear, it was regret. A flicker of understanding passed between them, a silent reckoning neither could name. As the day closed, Camille struck her gavel. "This hearing is adjourned until 9 a.m. tomorrow." The room emptied, slowly. Reporters whispered at the back. Observers filed out, murmuring. But Camille stayed seated, rearranging her notes with deliberate care. She could feel them behind her, the officers hesitating near the doors. Their footsteps stilled, as if they were debating whether to speak. They didn't. They left in silence, their boots heavy on the marble floor. Because even they understood now. This wasn't over. Not for them, not for her, and certainly not for the city watching. But for Camille, the challenge was never just this trial. It was the choices that would follow. The question lingering in every hallway, every headline. Would justice truly be served? By morning, word of what had happened inside that courtroom had spread like wildfire. People lined the benches. Some came out of curiosity. Others came to support Camille, though they knew, as judge, she could not take sides. But that didn't stop them from showing up, because sometimes just being there was an act of justice on its own. Camille entered the courtroom with her usual composed grace, her black robe flowing behind her like a banner of quiet authority. Every eye followed her as she took her place at the bench. This wasn't about personal vindication. It was about showing the community what real justice looked like when dignity met discipline. The prosecution wasted no time. Methodically, the attorney laid out the case against officers Carter and Daniels. Testimonies, body cam footage, department records. A young man named Ethan, the victim of the excessive force incident, took the stand. His voice trembled as he recounted the night he was thrown to the pavement during what should have been a routine traffic stop. "They didn't even let me speak," he said, glancing nervously toward the defense table. "They'd already decided I was guilty." "Did you resist?" the prosecutor asked gently. Ethan shook his head. "No, I was scared, but I did everything they told me. It didn't matter." The courtroom was still. The defense tried to discredit him during cross-examination, but Ethan stood firm. His fear had become courage, and Camille took note. When it was time for the defendants to testify, Carter was called first. He looked visibly shaken as he raised his hand and took the oath. Camille's presence, calm yet unrelenting, seemed to press down on him more heavily than any gavel. "Officer Carter," the prosecutor began, "you're charged with using excessive force. Can you explain your actions?" Carter hesitated, stealing a glance at Daniels. "I thought the situation was escalating. I made a judgment call." "You believe it was justified?" A pause. Then, "At the time, yes, but now." "I see. I could have handled it differently." The prosecutor leaned in. "You mean by not slamming an unarmed, compliant man to the ground?" Carter opened his mouth, then closed it. The silence said more than words ever could. If this story moved you, please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps give light to voices that deserve to be seen and heard. Daniels took the stand next. His tone was defensive, but his arguments unraveled under pressure. Every justification deepened the perception that neither officer truly grasped the gravity of their actions. Camille sat silently, her expression unreadable, but inside she felt a complex mix of disappointment and pity. These were not evil men, but they had been reckless, and the damage was real. As the trial days stretched on, it became increasingly clear. The evidence was damning. The prosecution's closing argument didn't just aim to convict, it sought to set a standard. This court, the prosecutor said, has the chance to send a message that those who abuse their power will be held accountable, not just for the harm they cause, but for the trust they betray. The defense's closing statements were desperate. Their logic stretched thin. Even Carter and Daniels seemed to sense it. They sat slumped, their bravado finally gone. Camille recessed the hearing. "We will reconvene next week for the verdict," she announced, voice even. As the courtroom emptied, the two officers lingered near the exit. For the first time, their faces showed something more than fear or pride. They looked aware. Perhaps not fully changed, but no longer untouched by the weight of consequence. The following week, the courtroom was filled to capacity. Reporters lined the back walls, pens poised. Camille stepped in, her presence steady, her tone unwavering. "This is no longer just a hearing," one journalist whispered. "It's a turning point." Camille spoke. "The role of law enforcement is to protect and serve, with integrity, fairness, and respect. When those entrusted with this duty abuse it, the damage goes far beyond the immediate victim. It undermines the very foundation of public trust." She paused, locking eyes with the officers. "The evidence has shown that Officers Carter and Daniels used unnecessary force that violated protocol and endangered a citizen's safety. This behavior reflects a pattern that must be addressed." She delivered the sentence firmly. Mandatory suspension without pay, full retraining under independent review, and a formal disciplinary mark to follow them through the remainder of their careers. Not revenge, not leniency. Accountability. As she struck the gavel to close the case, Carter rose slowly. His voice, barely audible, cracked as he said, "I'm sorry. I know it's not enough, but it's a start." Camille nodded. She didn't forgive, not yet, not with words, but she acknowledged him, because she knew true change doesn't begin with an apology. It begins with what happens after. When the room emptied, Camille remained seated. She looked out at the silent benches and the echo of her own decisions. Victory tasted complicated. For every trial like this, she knew, there were hundreds of voices unheard, stories untold, wrongs uncorrected. But this was a beginning. That evening she attended a community meeting at a local recreation center. The room was full, men and women, young and old, ready to share their own stories, their pain, their hope. She didn't come to speak, she came to listen. Afterward, an elderly woman approached her, gripping Camille's hand with surprising strength. "What you did in that courtroom," she whispered, eyes misting. "It meant everything to us." Camille smiled softly, humbled. Because justice, she now knew more than ever, was not just about verdicts or statutes. It was about showing up, listening, standing firm, and making sure the next person wouldn't have to stand alone. As the last of the young protesters left the courthouse steps that afternoon, Camille remained standing, alone but not lonely. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the jagged Colorado horizon, casting golden light across the marble facade. In her hand was a folded flyer, something one of the students had pressed into her palm, unsure of what to say but needing to connect. It was hand-drawn, with bold ink strokes and a single line in the center. "Justice isn't a moment, it's a direction." Camille stared at the words for a long time. It was true, she thought, not just intellectually, but in a way that resonated in her bones. Justice wasn't a finish line you crossed with applause. It was something you leaned into every day, knowing you might never reach it, but walking anyway, because every step mattered, every voice, every gesture. Her heels clicked gently as she turned from the steps and began walking toward her car. but the weight she carried had changed. Not heavier, not lighter, just different, sharper, more defined. There was clarity now. This wasn't about her. It never had been. The following week unfolded in slow, meaningful ways. Camille returned to her chambers, but not in isolation. She found herself surrounded by invitations to panels, forums, roundtables. But what moved her most weren't the big moments. It was the quiet one. A handwritten letter arrived from a mother in Greeley who had seen her son cry for the first time in years after watching Camille's verdict broadcast online. He said he felt seen, the letter read. He said he might want to study law now. At the farmer's market, a man she didn't recognize offered her a bag of apples. "You don't know me," he said, "but my brother, he went through something like that. Thank you for showing him someone who stood up." Each of these moments planted a seed, small, delicate, but real. Camille began working with a local reformed coalition, not as a symbol but as a strategist. Her courtroom had taught her the limits of law. Now she sought the elasticity of policy, where change could grow outward. She pushed for independent oversight of police complaints, transparent disciplinary records, and mandatory empathy training. To her surprise, not all resistance came from the places she expected. Some colleagues whispered about her objectivity. Others questioned whether she was too close to issues of race and justice. But Camille met each challenge with grace, not shrinking from discomfort, but using it as leverage. In every conversation she posed the same question. If we're not brave enough to do what's right, then why are we here at all? Marissa continued to stand at her side, working late into the evenings, sometimes just offering silence and presence. One night, as they sat reviewing policy drafts, Marissa looked up and said, "Do you realize this all started with a book in a park?" Camille smiled, that memory returning like a photo from a life before. "Funny," she said. "I went there to escape, and instead I found everything that matters." The irony wasn't lost on her. A public bench, a quiet afternoon, and a moment of unnecessary force had unlocked something vast. She had been humiliated, yes, but from that bruising came motion, and motion became movement. Camille often reflected now on the fragility of dignity, how easily it could be stripped from a person with handcuffs and suspicion, but also how powerfully it could return, with truth, with time, with courage. Dignity wasn't a gift, it was something we held on to for each other, like passing water from hand to hand through fire. Her thoughts deepened as she began mentoring students at the university, many of whom came from families who had known poverty, injustice, or invisibility. They didn't want speeches, they wanted to be seen, so Camille gave them her time, her honesty, her attention. One student, a Haitian-American girl named Liana, approached her after class one day. "My father was arrested wrongly," Liana said quietly. "They never apologized, we never got closure, but you made us feel like maybe we're not invisible." Camille didn't know what to say, so she reached for Liana's hand. That evening, Camille walked through her neighborhood, watching dusk settle across the rooftops. The trees rustled in the wind like old voices. A child laughed somewhere in the distance, chasing something unseen. And for a moment, the world felt both aching and beautiful. She thought of Ethan, the young man from the trial, how he stood his ground despite trembling, how truth lived in every word he spoke. She hoped he knew what courage looked like, because he had worn it that day like armor. She thought of Carter, the officer who had said, "I'm sorry," with more sorrow than defense. Whether or not redemption would come, Camille believed remorse mattered, not because it fixed the past, but because it dared to name the wound. And she thought of herself, not as a judge or an advocate, but as a woman who had once doubted whether her voice would matter. But now she knew. Change didn't come with applause, it came with effort, with listening, with showing up again and again, especially when no one was watching. At home, Camille lit a candle on her windowsill. It had become a quiet ritual, one flame in the dark, a reminder that progress wasn't loud. It flickered, fought the wind but kept glowing. As she prepared for bed, Camille opened her notebook, filled now with scribbled quotes, case notes, and reflections. On a blank page, she wrote, "Justice is not something we inherit, it's something we build." She set down the pen, and she believed it. Because in a world that too often rewarded the powerful and silenced the hurting, Camille Johnson had chosen something harder. To walk the long road, to stay in the fight, to be a voice when it would be easier to stay silent, to be light even when others tried to shut it out. And because of that choice, somewhere, someone would now feel brave enough to make theirs. If this story moved you, please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps give light to voices that deserve to be seen and heard.